Hello, everyone. At 9:23 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This morning, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before a joint session of the Canadian Parliament and delivered a speech that has fundamentally reversed the power dynamics of the U.S.-Canada crisis, leaving the White House scrambling to comprehend how completely the situation has shifted. For 5 weeks, the United States has been making demands, issuing threats, and expecting Canada to eventually capitulate. This morning, Carney flipped the script. In a 22-minute address, broadcast live across North America and around the world, Carney delivered an ultimatum to the United States. He outlined 5 specific actions that the U.S. must take within the next 14 days if it wants to avoid a permanent rupture of the bilateral relationship. He made clear that these are not negotiable demands. They are minimum requirements for Canada to even consider resuming diplomatic engagement. He stated explicitly that if the United States does not meet these requirements by March 18, 2026, Canada will proceed with a series of economic and strategic measures that will make the current crisis look minor by comparison. This is no longer the United States dictating terms to Canada. This is Canada dictating terms to the United States. And the fact that Carney feels confident enough to deliver this ultimatum publicly in Parliament tells you everything about how the balance of power has shifted over the past month. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through Carney's 5 demands and why each one represents a red line that Canada will not compromise on. I'm going to reveal the specific consequences Carney threatened if the United States does not comply by the deadline. I'm going to show you the immediate White House reaction and why officials are describing Carney's ultimatum as a diplomatic Pearl Harbor. I'm going to explain why Carney chose to deliver this ultimatum now and why the 14-day timeline is strategically calculated to maximize pressure on Trump. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what happens on March 18th when the deadline expires. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through Carney's parliamentary address because every section was designed to establish Canadian strength and American vulnerability. Carney opened by addressing the Canadian people directly. He said, "For 5 weeks, we have endured threats to our sovereignty, attacks on our economy, and attempts to coerce us into subordination. We have responded with patience, with strategic planning, and with the support of allies who recognize that Canada's fight is about principles that matter to all democracies. We have demonstrated that Canada can withstand pressure. We have demonstrated that Canada can build alternatives to American partnership. And we have demonstrated that Canada will not surrender its independence for temporary relief from policies that should never have been imposed." The chamber erupted in applause. Carney waited for silence and then continued. But patience has limits. Canada has done everything possible to create space for diplomatic resolution. We have offered compromise. We have sought dialogue. We have shown restraint even as our sovereignty was questioned and our economy was attacked. The United States has rejected every effort at reasonable negotiation. Yesterday, in a call with President Trump, I concluded that the current U.S. administration is not capable of treating Canada as an equal partner. Therefore, Canada is done waiting. Canada is done negotiating from a position of assumed weakness. It is time for the United States to understand that this crisis can only be resolved on terms that respect Canadian sovereignty and Canadian interests. Carney then delivered the 5 demands. He said, if the United States wishes to restore a functional relationship with Canada, the following actions must be taken by March 18th, 2026 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. These are not requests. These are requirements. The chamber went completely silent. Demand 1, complete removal of all tariffs on Canadian goods. Carney said, every tariff imposed by the United States on Canadian products must be eliminated immediately and unconditionally. No phase-in periods, no exceptions, no conditions. The tariffs were illegal under USMCA. They are removed entirely, or there is no path forward. Demand 2, formal written commitment to NORAD and intelligence sharing. Carney said, the United States must provide a signed, legally binding commitment that NORAD will continue to operate at full capacity, that joint defense arrangements will be honored, and that intelligence sharing through Five Eyes will be restored immediately. This commitment must be signed by President Trump and countersigned by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. It must include specific provisions preventing unilateral U.S. withdrawal or modification without Canadian consent. Demand 3, public retraction of sovereignty threats. Carney said, President Trump must issue a public statement, delivered from the White House, retracting any suggestion that Canadian provinces should or could become part of the United States. The statement must explicitly acknowledge that Canada is a sovereign nation whose territorial integrity is not subject to American political commentary. This is non-negotiable. Demand 4, compensation for economic damage. Carney said, the United States must compensate Canada for economic damage caused by the illegal tariffs. We calculate that damage at $14.7 billion based on lost trade, disrupted supply chains, and costs associated with building alternative partnerships. The compensation can be structured as trade credits, direct payment, or infrastructure investment in Canadian border facilities, but the debt must be acknowledged and must be paid. Demand 5, recognition of Canadian resource sovereignty. Carney said, the United States must formally acknowledge that Canadian natural resources, including oil, natural gas, electricity, and critical minerals, are owned by Canada and are sold on terms determined by Canada. Any future requests for guaranteed supply must be negotiated as commercial agreements between sovereign equals, not imposed through political pressure. The United States must renounce any claim to privileged or guaranteed access to Canadian resources. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you are Carney's threatened consequences if the U.S. does not meet these demands, and why those consequences would be catastrophic for the American economy. Carney said, if the United States does not meet these 5 requirements by March 18th at 5:00 p.m., Canada will immediately implement the following measures. He then outlined 6 specific actions that would represent total economic war. First, complete suspension of energy exports to the United States. 2, Carney said, all crude oil, natural gas, and electricity exports to the United States will be halted immediately. Canada will redirect those exports to buyers in Asia and Europe who have already committed to purchase agreements. This is not a negotiating position. This is a consequence. Second, formal withdrawal from USMCA. Carney said, Canada will invoke the withdrawal provisions of the United States and Mexico-Canada Agreement and will exit the treaty effective immediately. All trade between the U.S. and Canada will be conducted under WTO rules, which means significant tariff increases on American exports to Canada and the elimination of preferential access that U.S. companies currently enjoy. Third, closure of airspace and maritime routes. And Carney said, Canada will close Canadian airspace to U.S. commercial and military aircraft that do not have explicit flight-by-flight approval. We will close Canadian maritime routes, including the Northwest Passage and the St. Lawrence Seaway, to U.S. flagged vessels. This will significantly increase costs and transit times for American shipping and aviation. Fourth, financial system decoupling. Carney said, Canada will complete the financial restrictions already in place by prohibiting all new Canadian investment in U.S. assets, requiring Canadian pension funds and institutional investors to divest from U.S. holdings over a 24-month period, and establishing currency controls that limit the convertibility of Canadian dollars into U.S. dollars. This will remove approximately $480 billion in Canadian capital from U.S. financial markets. Fifth, complete military separation. Carney said, Canada will formally suspend all military cooperation with the United States. NORAD will be dissolved. Joint exercises will be canceled. Canadian military personnel will be withdrawn from all U.S. facilities. Canada will establish independent continental defense systems using NATO support and will coordinate future security operations exclusively through European and Commonwealth partners. Sixth, alliance against U.S. economic coercion. Carney said, Canada will work with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and other democracies to establish a formal framework for countering American economic coercion. This framework will include coordinated responses to U.S. tariffs, mutual support for countries facing U.S. pressure, and the development of trade and financial systems that can operate independently of American participation. Carney then closed his address. He said, these consequences are not threats. They are commitments. If the United States chooses not to meet Canada's requirements by March 18th, these measures will be implemented immediately, and they will not be reversed until the United States demonstrates, through sustained action over years, that it can be a reliable partner. The choice is America's. Canada has made our choice. We choose sovereignty. We choose independence. And we choose partnerships based on equality and mutual respect. The United States has 14 days to decide whether it wants to be one of those partners or whether it prefers to be isolated from the most important bilateral relationship it has ever had. Carney sat down. The chamber stood and applauded for over 3 minutes. Receipt number 1. The market panic. Within minutes of Carney's speech, U.S. markets went into absolute freefall. The Dow Jones dropped 1,147 points in the first 30 minutes of trading, a 3.2% decline. Energy stocks collapsed as traders priced in the possibility that Canadian oil and gas exports could be cut off within 2 weeks. Utilities serving the Midwest and Northeast plunged as traders realized those companies could face electricity shortages if Canadian power is suspended. Financial stocks fell sharply as traders calculated the impact of $480 billion in Canadian capital being removed from U.S. markets. The S&P 500 fell 4.1%, the worst single-day decline since the COVID pandemic. The market is screaming that Carney's ultimatum is credible and that the consequences he threatened would devastate the U.S. economy. Receipt number 2. The European endorsement. Within 90 minutes of Carney's speech, the European Union issued a statement. The European Union supports Canada's position and believes the 5 requirements outlined by Prime Minister Carney are reasonable and appropriate. We call on the United States to meet these requirements and to restore the partnership that has served North America and the world for generations. The EU stands ready to support Canada in implementing any measures necessary to defend Canadian sovereignty. That is the EU explicitly endorsing Carney's ultimatum and promising to support Canada if the U.S. refuses to comply. France, Germany, and the UK issued separate statements echoing the EU position. Canada is not alone. Canada has the backing of the world's largest economic bloc. Receipt number 3. The Pentagon alarm. According to sources, the Pentagon held an emergency meeting immediately after Carney's speech. Military officials are deeply concerned about the threat to dissolve NORAD because doing so would create massive gaps in continental air defense that would take years to rebuild. The Pentagon assessment is that if NORAD is dissolved and Canada builds an independent defense system using NATO support, the United States loses early warning capabilities for threats approaching from the north, loses coordinated air defense over the Arctic, and loses intelligence sharing that is critical for homeland security. Pentagon officials are reportedly preparing a memo for Trump explaining that accepting Carney's demands is essential for U.S. national security and that the alternative, losing NORAD and military cooperation with Canada, is strategically unacceptable. Receipt number 4. The 14-day calculation. Why did Carney set a 14-day deadline? According to analysts, the timeline is designed to create maximum pressure. 14 days is long enough that Trump cannot claim he was ambushed or didn't have time to respond, but short enough that Trump cannot delay, obfuscate, or wait for the crisis to fade from public attention. March 18th falls on a Wednesday, midweek, which means markets will be open and watching. The deadline also comes just before the end of the first quarter, meaning that if U.S. companies are facing the loss of Canadian energy or Canadian markets, they will need to report those impacts in quarterly earnings, creating additional pressure on Trump from the business community. Carney chose 14 days because it's the perfect window to force Trump into a decision he doesn't want to make. Here's what happened in Washington. At 10:15 a.m., the National Security Council held an emergency meeting. According to sources, the discussion was chaotic. Officials debated whether Carney's ultimatum was a bluff or whether Canada would actually implement the threatened consequences. The intelligence community's assessment was that Carney is not bluffing, that Canada has spent the past 5 weeks building the infrastructure to implement these measures, and that Canada has secured enough international support to sustain the economic pain better than the U.S. can. At noon, Trump met with his economic advisors. According to sources, Trump was told that if Canada implements even half of the threatened measures, the U.S. faces immediate recession, an energy crisis, and financial market collapse. Trump reportedly asked whether the U.S. could retaliate in ways that would hurt Canada more. Advisors explained that the U.S. has no effective retaliation